You bought me.
I paid the end of price, that's all.
This fence not to keep me in.
To keep the world out.
Red Willow, Arizona Territory, autumn 1883. The wind that morning carried more dust than mercy. It rolled down from the mesas like an old animal wheezing through its ribs, scattering grit through the alleys of Red Willow, a town that looked built more out of exhaustion than timber. The smell of whiskey and sweat clung to the planks. Men shouted louder than the horses. Silver coins clinked like the world's only prayer. And somewhere behind all of it came the dull rhythm of a hammer striking wood, the auction block being tested for weight. They were selling again. Not cattle this time. Aiyana stood barefoot on that sun-bleached platform, the splinters biting into her soles until the blood dried black against the dust. Her wrists were bound in coarse rope, the skin rubbed raw, the marks still weeping from days of travel. She had not eaten since yesterday, though she no longer felt hunger, only the hollow calm that arrives when the body forgets it belongs to itself. The wind tangled her hair and lifted the torn hem of her deerskin dress. Somewhere in the crowd a man laughed, another spat. The spittle landed near her toes. She didn't flinch. Flinching only made them laugh louder. $2, a voice called. 3, another answered. 5 for the savage. The auctioneer grinned, one gold tooth flashing in the light. He slapped the plank beside her ankle. Come on, gents. She eats little, works hard. Make it worth my trouble. Aiyana stared at the ground. Her name, the one her mother had given her, meaning eternal blossom, was a sound she had not heard in weeks. Here she was not a name, only a price waiting to rise. 6, a man's voice said, not loud but sharp enough to cut through the wind. Heads turned. He stood near the edge of the square, one boot resting against the hitching, post his coat a shade between dust and ash. Silas Walker. His hair was sun-faded, his face drawn tight around a scar that sliced from his jaw to his collarbone, a mark left long ago by a blade or a bullet. People in Red Willow told both stories, though he never corrected either. His left shoulder hung stiff, an old cavalry wound that had taught him how to live with pain quietly. He reached into his coat, took out $6 silver and placed them on the rail. Untie her. The crowd went quiet enough to hear the wind scrape across the roofs. The auctioneer hesitated, caught between greed and disbelief. Then greed won, as it always did. Your loss, mister, he said, grabbing a knife from his belt. He sliced through the rope around her wrists. The fibers fell to the planks, coiling like dead snakes. Freed Aiyana swayed on her feet. The ground tilted, and for a breath she thought she might fall. A hand appeared in front of her, rough sun-browned open, not forcing, only offering. She hesitated. The hand stayed there, patient as stone. She took it. Silas steadied her, then released. Come on, 2 words, soft and spare. No command in them, no pity either, only motion. They stepped off the platform. Behind them the crowd muttered, disappointed. The kind of men who could watch chains being sold like tobacco had little interest once mercy entered the price. The wind chased them through the narrow street. Dust swirled around their boots. Silas led her to the trough behind the feed store, where the water still shimmered clean from morning refill. He dipped a tin cup and set it in her hands. Aiyana hesitated. Her throat worked once before she lifted the cup, drinking too fast, water spilling down her chin. She coughed. Silas took the cup, filled it again, and handed it back without a word. This time she drank slower. He pulled a folded blanket from his saddlebag, wool gray, worn thin at the corners, and laid it over her shoulders, careful not to touch skin. The blanket swallowed her frame. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, the first moment in months that warmth didn't come with a price. When she looked up again, he was already adjusting his saddle. Can you ride? He asked. She nodded, unsure. Then hold the horn. I'll keep you steady. He mounted first, then helped her up, guiding her gently onto the front of the saddle. His hand rested near her waist, not on it, just close enough to catch her if she slipped. She held the blanket tight and looked straight ahead as he turned the horse toward the road that led out of town. Behind them, the auctioneer's laughter echoed faintly through the wind. They rode for miles before either spoke again. Red Willow shrank behind them until it was only a smear of smoke against the horizon. The land opened wide, dry grass, low mesas, and sky that seemed too big for Mercy. The horse's hooves drummed steady against the packed dirt. Silas slowed the pace when he noticed the tremor in her shoulders. "Cold?" he asked. She didn't answer, only tightened the blanket. He shifted his coat open enough to block the wind from her side. She noticed, but said nothing. Gratitude was still a language she didn't trust. When the road curved toward the hills, he stopped by a patch of scrub oak. "Rest a minute." He dismounted, then offered his hand again. She slipped down light as a breath, and landed awkwardly, knees shaking. He steadied her elbow, then stepped back. She crouched, touched the dirt with her fingertips, and held it there, pressing her palm flat. The soil was dry, still warm from sun, but it was earth, not the boards of a wagon floor, not the iron belly of a cage. Silas watched without speaking. He took out his knife and cut the last length of rope still hanging from her wrist. Instead of tossing it away, he knelt, dug a small hole at the base of a rock, and buried it. Aiyana watched him cover it with dust and pat the ground once, like a man sealing a grave. He didn't say what it meant. He didn't have to. When he looked up, her eyes met his for the first time. "Eat," he said, handing her a strip of jerky. She took it bit carefully, chewing slow. He ate a smaller piece himself, standing guard without making it obvious. A hawk circled above them, a dark fleck against the pale sky. "Your name?" he asked after a while. She hesitated, tasting the English on her tongue like something sharp. "Aiyana." He nodded. "Silas Walker." Their names hung between them, the first trade made freely that day. By dusk, the air turned colder. They followed a dry creek bed that led toward the distant outline of Silas's ranch. The horizon blazed in copper light, and every shadow stretched long like a warning. When the cabin finally came into view, Aiyana blinked, as if unsure it was real. A small wooden house crouched near a split-rail fence, one corner of the roof sagging. Smoke drifted thinly from the chimney. It wasn't much, but it stood, and it was quiet. Silas dismounted, winced as his shoulder caught. "Here," he said, motioning for her to wait while he tied the horse. Then he offered his hand again for balance as she climbed down. She touched it briefly, then pulled away, keeping distance. Inside, the cabin smelled of dry wood and old leather. A stove squatted near the far wall, still warm from the morning fire. There was one bed, a table with 2 chairs and shelves lined with jars of beans and flour. Everything was neat, not polished, the kind of order that belonged to someone who'd learned how to live alone. Silas pointed toward the chair nearest the stove. "Sit." She hesitated. He nodded once. She sat, slow eyes darting to him as if waiting for correction. None came. He ladled beans from a pot left on the stove into a tin bowl, set it before her, and stepped back. She stared at it, then at him. He leaned against the counter, arms folded. After a moment, she ate fast at first, then slower when she realized he wouldn't take it away. When the bowl was empty, he filled it again without asking. Her hands trembled less now. The firelight caught her cheekbones sharp from hunger and the bruises along her neck. Silas saw but didn't ask. Some stories didn't need telling on the first night. He reached into a trunk near the bed, pulled out a clean cotton shirt, and laid it across the blanket. "You can change. I'll check the barn." She waited until the door shut behind him before standing. The blanket slipped to her elbows as she lifted the shirt. It smelled of soap and smoke, soft from years of washing. She slipped it on the hem, falling nearly to her knees, and wrapped the wool blanket around her waist like a skirt. The cabin's stillness pressed against her ears. No shouting, no chains clinking, just the tick of cooling metal and the small crackle of wood. She exhaled for what felt like the first time. Outside, Silas fed the horse, checked the corral fence, and stayed gone longer than needed. Mercy, he'd learned, was best given space to breathe. When he returned, she was sitting again, straighter this time, the firelight softening her face. He added another log to the stove. "Fire'll hold till morning," he said. She watched him spread his coat on the floor near the door, rolling it into a pillow. He pointed toward the bed. "You take that. I'll stay here." Her brow creased. No man had ever offered comfort without a price. She shook her head quickly, clutching the blanket. He didn't argue. He just lay down on the floor, back to the wall, one arm resting over his eyes, the rifle within reach. After a long silence, she whispered why his voice came steady, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "Because no one deserves chains." The words hung in the air, heavy and clean. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the silence turned into something else, not fear, not command, but room. Aiyana lay down on the bed, the quilt rough beneath her fingers. She watched the fire until her eyes blurred. Across the room, Silas's breathing steadied slow, and even a rhythm that matched the soft hiss of the stove. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the first night in a long time when neither waited for pain to wake them. By dawn, frost rimmed the window. Light crept across the floorboards, finding the rifle by the door, the empty bowl on the table, and the faint shape of two people still learning what freedom sounded like when spoken quietly. Outside, Red Willow kept trading what men could own. Inside, something else had begun, not ownership, not debt, only the first fragile act of staying. Morning didn't arrive so much as gather itself along the floorboards. Hoofscuffs dried to dust on the threshold. Last night's ash kept its small heat in the stove. Silas was already awake, eyes on the pale seam of horizon. Aiyana sat up to the sound of water, tipping into a tin cup, not boots or iron. "Morning," he said, and the house answered with quiet instead of echo. She lifted a hand, not quite a wave, not quite a shield. He poured water from the jug into a tin cup and set it on the table. When she reached for it, he stepped back, a pace-making room, as if space itself were a gift. "Breakfast," he added, voice low. "Beans again, and coffee strong enough to scrape the tongue clean." He didn't apologize for plain food. Plain food kept Bones from whispering too loud about hunger. They ate facing the stove. He finished first, but remained seated, letting the quiet turn from awkward to ordinary. When she laid the spoon down, he nodded toward the door. "Come outside," he said. She paused, then rose. The cabin's threshold was a small country to cross. Outside, the morning air bit her feet. She flinched, and he noticed. He disappeared inside and returned with a pair of wool socks, the sort that had outlived 3 winters, and still had one more left in them. "For now," he said. She looked at the socks like a puzzle, then slid them on. The wool pricked her skin. Her toes curled into a heat that felt like permission. They stood in the yard. The land spread out in all directions, yellow grass bowed by wind, the corral leaning with age. Aiyana drew a breath so deep it surprised her. The air tasted of iron and juniper. She turned her face toward the light, then kneeled and pressed her palm to the soil. Not a prayer anyone would recognize, only a touch that said the earth still remembered her. Silas pointed with his chin toward the barn. "We start there." He didn't list rules. He didn't say what she owed. He showed her where the feed was kept, how to scatter grain for the hens, how to check the water trough. She watched his hands, not his mouth. When he lifted a log and his shoulder seized, she caught the flinch he tried to hide. "Old wound," he said, as if that explained everything and nothing. She nodded. The nod wasn't pity. It was a marker on the map they were drawing between them. He handed her a small hatchet. "Split that one," he said, meaning a short log set upright on a stump. He stood close enough to correct a mistake, but far enough to let the mistake happen without shame. Her first swing glanced off and bit the stump. She reset the log, moved her feet, planted them like he had, and brought the blade down. The wood opened with a sharp report that seemed too loud for morning. She straightened, and something small in her shoulders lifted. "Good," he said, and didn't smile until she looked away. They worked in that rhythm show attempt adjust until sweat warmed her under the shirt and the frost burned off the fence rails. She learned the weight of the hammer, the patience of wire, the way nails find the straight edge if your hand is steady. He learned the cadence of her silence, the one for concentration, the one for fear, the one for memory, pressing its thumb to her throat. When the last rail was braced for the day, he stepped back, considering the hole. "Hold," he said, and passed her a length of wire to keep while he tied off the other end. Their hands missed twice, touched once, then found the wires pull together. He didn't look at the touch, neither did she. The wire held. That was the point. Around mid-morning, a wagon creaked along the far road, throwing a small cloud of dust behind it. Aiyana's body stiffened, as if pulled by a string eyes locked on the moving shape. Silas stepped between her and the road, casual enough not to make it worse, deliberate enough to make it better. He rested a hand near his holster. The wagon rolled past without turning in an older man with a hat pulled low, a milk can rattling in the back. The moment stretched, then snapped. "No one touches you here," Silas said, not looking at her when he said it. It was a promise that wore plain clothes. It fit him. They went back inside when the wind rose and the hens became loud with opinions. He boiled coffee more for the warmth than the taste. She watched the steam twist the way breath twists when you carry it too long. On the table lay the strip of cloth she had used to wipe her wrists. The skin was less angry now, though the grooves remained. She picked up the cloth and folded it into a narrow band. "May I?" she asked, surprising them both with how the English arranged itself. He nodded. She came near and wrapped his shoulder through the shirt, not over the wound, but where the muscle strained. Her fingers worked with a care that refused to call itself tenderness. He held still, letting her do the work. When she tied the knot, he tested the lift of his arm and grunted once, not pain exactly, but the admission of being human. "Better," he said. She stepped back. The air between them had the clean feel of a floor just swept. He put on a canvas work coat and handed her another smaller patched at the elbow, brown gone almost gray. "Yours," he said. She slid into it. The coat was heavy, the way belonging is heavy when you first put it on. She tugged the sleeves up so her hands showed. The coat changed her posture. It moved her from rescued to resident by an inch you could measure. He took her out again to the yard. "Show you the ridge," he said. They climbed the slope behind the barn where a low rise offered a view of the road. From there the cabin looked like something a stubborn man would build, square-shouldered and plain. The sky went on forever. Wind combed the grass from right to left, then left to right, as if deciding. "Watch from here if I'm gone," he said. "Dust line riders. Take the stove for cover inside." She repeated the words not because she didn't understand, but because repetition builds bones around courage. "Stove for cover," she said. Yes. They stood together, and for a long minute there was nothing to see but light. The distance made time behave. Her breath slowed to match the wind. When she turned, he was already heading down, and she followed the coat, catching the sun and giving it back in dull flashes. Back at the corral, he showed her the halter knots that don't slip the knot that does when you need it to. He didn't touch her hands to correct them. He tied one alongside her, then cut his knot open so she could tie it herself. The third attempt held true. "You'll need that," he said. She looked at the rope then, at the dirt, then up. "I know rope," she said, meaning the old kind. He understood. He put the rope away like a word you use carefully. They ate a noon meal that didn't quite deserve the name jerky. The heel of yesterday's bread, a few slices of apple his neighbor had traded for fence boards last fall. After he set a pot of potatoes to boil, the cabin filled with a smell that felt like a small holiday. She moved without asking, found the tin plates of cloth, arranged them on the table. It was the first time she did a task on the ranch that wasn't about survival. It was about living. In the afternoon, he worked at the north fence line where the wind hit hardest. She carried nails in a small leather pouch at her hip, handed them one by one as he set each plank. A nail bent, then another. She frowned, then corrected the angle. Metal met wood with the clean sound of something agreeing with itself. He gave a short nod, which in his grammar was praise written in bold. Toward the middle of the work, she stopped and tilted her head as if listening for a memory. Then she walked a few steps to the base of a red willow sapling near the fence, kneeled and brushed the dirt. She took from her pocket a tiny thing, a bead, bone white, not expensive, not sacred, the kind of everyday bead used to edge a hem. She pressed it into the soil and smoothed the surface with the flat of her palm. He didn't ask. Some acts speak clearer when left alone. Clouds gathered on the western rim. The wind had the cold bite that says evening will not be kind. They finished the last board, and he straightened, slowly testing the shoulder. Aiyana watched the jaw tighten and loosen. She took the hammer from him and hung it on the peg without being asked. Inside, she stirred the pot while he split kindling. When the potatoes were ready, she salted them in her palm, and sprinkled it from high so the salt fell like snow. He poured coffee, and did not try to fill the quiet with words that would only make it thinner. After they ate, he checked the rifle, then laid it back by the door in plain sight. He wanted her to see readiness was not the same as fear. He wanted her to know what he would do if someone came to take what didn't belong to them. He pulled a second blanket from the trunk and tossed it onto the foot of the bed. "Cold tonight," he said. She looked from the blanket to the coat laid on the floor near the door and then back to him. Her eyes asked a question with more trust than the day had started with. "Floor's fine," he said. She held his gaze, then pointed bed floor him, then the space beside her on the mattress, a small gesture drawn in the air, careful and deliberate. She left a space, not an invitation to cross, but an acknowledgement that the door had two sides and both could stand open. He stared a beat too long, then shook his head, once the kind of refusal that contained respect, not distance. "Not yet," he said. The yet was a bridge built from a single plank. Night fell fast. Wind pressed the cabin's seams and found where boards still needed a nail. He stuffed rags into the worst gaps and added a log to the stove. The fire did its work with small noises like a child's sleep. When the storm began, it wasn't rain. It was a moan of cold air dragging itself across the hills. The cabin held. Aiyana sat with her back to the bedpost, the blanket high around her shoulders, eyes on the stove. He took the chair and stretched his legs, the rifle within reach of his foot. Their breath synced without trying. After a while she spoke words, picked carefully like berries where thorns grow thicker than fruit. "You bought me," she said, then touched the floor with two fingertips. "Then you buried the rope." He stared at the iron belly of the stove. "I paid to end a price," he said. "That's all." She waited, and the waiting invited truth. "Men take what they can," he went on. "I've been one of those men. Not like them." He nodded toward town. Different uniform. Same noise in the head. She watched him with an expression that made him feel counted and weighed, not judged. "War?" she asked. "War," he said. The word had no romance in it. "I came home to nothing that looked like home." She nodded again once. "I had home," she said, hand touching her chest, then opening outward to mean others, a circle, a fire, a mountain. "I had words." She let the hand fall. Smoke took them. They let the stove answer for a while. The iron ticked as the wood settled. The wind combed the roof and found no purchase. He stood and peeled his shirt away from his shoulder, just enough for her to see the puckered seam of the old wound. She didn't move toward it. She didn't offer compassion like a poultice. She only looked and then met his eyes, saying without saying, "I see the thing that shaped you, not the man you were when it did." He pulled the shirt back on, and Saturday, "You stay as long as you want," he said. "If there's somewhere else, I stay," she said, before he could finish. The words surprised her with their certainty. They surprised him with how much room they made in his ribcage. He nodded, the kind of nod that said everything words might ruin. He stood and banked the fire low. When he lay on the floor, he folded his coat twice to lift his head. She lay back and turned toward the window where the frost had begun to write its white language across the glass. Silence came again, but not the kind that carried weight like a chain. This silence carried weight like a door bar set in place after a long day, the sound of a house deciding to be a house. "Good night," he said. She answered in her language first, then in his. "Good night." The storm thinned toward midnight. The wind died into a whisper that barely reached the eaves. Somewhere in the yard, a hen made a dream noise and went back to its small duty of sleeping. The stove breathed slow, and in the space between the bed and the door, between the one who had been owned by the world's worst truth and the one who had helped unwrite it, a new truth began to take shape. Not safety, exactly, not yet, but shelter, and the first stubborn desire to keep it. By morning there would be more work. The north fence would sag again where wind loves to prove its point. A nail would split a board and need replacing. The road would stay visible from the ridge, and eyes would keep watch. But when the first light fingered the floorboards, it would find two coats hanging on the wall instead of 1-2 plates drying on the shelf, and a bead hidden under a young red willow holding the ground to its promise. The day would begin, and neither of them would run. Red Willow, Arizona Territory. 2 weeks later. The sun had shifted its angle since the day she arrived. The mornings were warmer now, though the wind still carried a blade at dawn. Aiyana woke before Silas always. She liked to listen to the quiet before his boots touched the floor, to the stove's faint hum, to the hens outside, whispering for grain. She liked knowing what the house sounded like when safety was still asleep. Every morning began the same water drawn from the pump. Coffee, brewed in the blackened pot, and beans, simmered slow. The work was ordinary, and that was what made it extraordinary. Ordinary meant she could plan beyond the next hour. Outside, Silas was already at the corral, hammering nails into a fence post that refused to stay straight. He didn't look up when she stepped into the light, but his voice carried. "Posts leaning," he said. "Wind pushed," she answered. Her English had grown steady, still accented by vowels that carried the shape of canyons. He glanced at her, saw the calm in her shoulders, and said nothing more. She walked to him, took the shovel, and began packing soil around the post's base. They worked in silence that didn't need explanation. When the post held firm, Silas nodded. "Strong," he said. Aiyana tapped the wood once. "Together," she replied. The day unfolded like that, brief exchanges, mostly action. She mended a rip in the saddle blanket, milked the goat that had started trusting her hands, and gathered eggs. He repaired the gate hinge and split firewood until the old wound in his shoulder demanded mercy. She saw it before he spoke and took the axe. He didn't protest. The rhythm of her swings filled the yard, sharp, even, clean. By noon, the smell of baked earth mingled with the faint sweetness of bread she had tried to make for the first time. It was heavy, misshapen, but when Silas broke a piece and chewed, he said only "good." She laughed, a small, startled sound. It startled him, too. He hadn't heard laughter in the cabin before. It seemed to lift the roof a little higher. After lunch, clouds began to form over the ridge. Silas checked the sky. "Storm'll pass north," he said. Aiyana shaded her eyes. "Sky lies," she murmured. He almost smiled. Sometimes they worked faster, bringing tools inside, covering the woodpile. When the first drops fell, they stood under the porch, watching the dust darken. Rain in Red Willow was brief, but honest. It hit hard, cooled the air, and left the smell of iron in its wake. Aiyana held her face to it. Silas leaned on the post, hat low, pretending not to watch her. When the rain thinned, she crouched and touched the mud. "Soil lives again," she said. He looked down at her hand, small, strong, the skin now clean of rope scars. "So do you," he said quietly. That night, as the stove glowed low, she set something on the table, a piece of smooth bone she had carved into a small bird. It wasn't decoration. It was memory turned harmless. She placed it near the window where Dawn could find it. "For the house," she said. He studied it, nodded once. "The house'll like that." They shared coffee, the kind that left grit at the bottom of the cup. She asked, "You had wife?" He shook his head. "Had a war, had a horse, lost both." She traced the rim of her cup. "War takes all names," she said. "Yours too, almost," she answered. "But one man said it right." He didn't ask who. Some stories shouldn't be cornered. Later, when the wind picked up, he checked the door latch. She watched him move, precise, never hurried. When he caught her gaze, he said, "Fence'll need another rail tomorrow. You can help me measure." She nodded. "I know measure." He smiled, the ghost of one. "You know most things." Before sleeping, she stepped outside. The moon hung low, pale, against the still, damp sky. She pressed her palm to the earth and whispered something in her own tongue. Not a prayer, not exactly gratitude, just the act of speaking back to the land. From the doorway, Silas watched her silhouette against the silver grass. He didn't interrupt. Some silences deserved their own witness. When she returned, she pulled the extra blanket from his side of the floor and handed it to him. "Cold comes from under," she said. He took it wordless. They lay again, she on the bed, he on the floor, the stove breathing between them. The night was softer, now filled with sounds that meant life instead of threat. The pop of wood, the steady creak of wind against shutters. Before sleep claimed her, she said quietly, "Tomorrow, I fix the south fence too." He didn't answer right away. "Then tomorrow we fix it." And that was how trust entered the house, not as a declaration, but as shared labor, a fence mended plank by plank, until the land and the people who worked it began to hold. Red Willow, Arizona Territory. Early winter 1883. The frost came early that year. Frost sang underfoot like breaking glass, and every breath rose white before fading into the empty air. Silas woke before sunrise, checked the stove, then stepped outside to feed the horse. He could see his breath, and beyond it, the long road that cut through the valley, a pale scar on the land. Inside, Aiyana stirred the fire to life, setting coffee to boil. She had learned the rhythm of this place, how to wake before the light, how to listen for the small sounds that meant everything was still safe. The cabin had become a heartbeat she could trust. But that morning, the sound that came up the road didn't belong to safety. It was the slow, measured crunch of wagon wheels over frozen dirt, the sound of men who came for business, not visiting. Silas heard it first. He looked toward the ridge and saw a dark shape moving against the pale dawn, a wagon, 2 horses, and 3 men. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there letting the cold bite his fingers, his jaw working slow. Then he called through the open door, "Stay inside." Aiyana stepped to the window, who he didn't answer yet. He didn't need to. The answer was always the same when the world came calling someone who believed ownership was the same thing as order. The wagon pulled up near the corral. The man riding in front wore a black coat and a deputy's badge that had seen more polish than law. Beside him sat a merchant, the kind with soft hands, and a voice trained to sound official. The third was just muscle, a man, with eyes that never looked at faces, only at the places they could strike. "Mornin', mister." Walker, the deputy, said, his tone friendly, in the way snakes are smooth. "Got a bit of a matter to clear up. Word in town says you bought yourself property that wasn't for sale." Silas wiped his hands on his coat. "Don't own property," he said. "That's the trouble," the merchant cut in. "The girl you took Apache stock belonged to a holding company out of Tucson. Paper says she was indentured labor. You can't just walk off with government assets." Silas looked at him the way one looks at a man describing a language you don't recognize. "You calling a person an asset, that's the term on record." Aiyana stepped into the doorway. Her hair was tied back, her face calm but pale against the cold. The merchant pointed. "That's her." Silas didn't turn. "You'd best put that hand down," he said, voice level. The merchant's finger lowered without instruction. The deputy cleared his throat. "Now I'm sure we can settle this neat. Man of your standing, veteran, quiet type. You turn her over, no harm done. There's paperwork, but I'll make it easy." Silas's eyes moved to the fence line, then to the ground between them. "This land's mine," he said. "Fence runs true. Nobody crosses it without an invite." The deputy smiled the way men smile when they think rules are on their side. "Law says—" "The law's a long way from here," Silas said. For a heartbeat the air froze harder than the ground. The merchant shifted in his seat. "We'll come back with a warrant." "Do that," Silas said. "Bring a judge who still remembers the word man." The deputy's horse pawed the dirt. He looked past Silas to the figure standing in the doorway. "Ma'am, you can speak for yourself. You want to stay with this man?" The question hung between them like a drawn blade. Aiyana's eyes flicked from the deputy to Silas, to the man who hadn't touched her since that first day, who had built fences wide enough for trust to breathe inside. She stepped off the threshold boots crunching frost and walked until she stood at Silas's side. "I stay," she said. The deputy opened his mouth to argue, but the tone in her voice stopped him. It wasn't defiance, shouted, it was truth spoken from the center of the earth. "I stay here," she repeated. "No one owns me." Silas didn't move. Didn't need to. The words did more than any rifle could. The merchant muttered something under his breath, turned the reins and pulled the horses around. The deputy lingered a second longer, eyes flicking between them, then spat into the dirt. "You just bought yourself trouble, Walker." "Already paid," Silas said. The wagon rolled away, leaving tracks like scars in the frost. The sound faded down the road until the land went quiet again. Aiyana stood there watching until they disappeared behind the ridge. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the sudden release of it. Silas reached for his gloves more to keep them busy than warm. "You spoke good," he said. She looked at him. "I spoke true." He nodded, then bent to check the fence rail nearest the road, as though fixing what men had touched could make the morning right again. She joined him without a word, passing nails, steadying boards. By the time the sun burned through the fog, they had mended the rail and packed new soil at its base. When they finished, she stood and pressed her palm flat against the wood. "This fence," she said, "not to keep me in." "No," Silas said, "to keep the world out." That evening the cabin smelled of coffee and smoke. Aiyana sat near the window, sewing a tear in her coat. Silas cleaned the rifle, checked the cartridges, then set it back in its place by the door. When she finished sewing, she spoke without looking up. "They will come again." He exhaled through his nose. "Maybe, maybe not. Men like that depend on how bored the world gets." She nodded. "If they come, I stand with you." He smiled just a corner of his mouth. "You already did." Outside, the last light of day faded behind the red hills. The air smelled of snow. Silas went to the door and looked out one last time. The fence gleamed silver in the half-light, every board straight, every wire tight. He closed the door softly and slid the bolt into place. Inside, the warmth held steady, and for the first time since the day he'd bought her freedom, he realized the house no longer echoed. It sounded lived and like something shared, not borrowed. Red Willow, Arizona territory. Late winter 1883. Snow fell quiet that morning, soft enough to hear it land. Aiyana stood on the porch, wrapped in Silas's coat, watching the flakes melt against her hands. The ranch below lay still, fences, half buried, the corral empty, smoke curling from the chimney. Behind her, Silas poured coffee into 2 tin mugs. "Fence won't last till spring," he said. "Then we build again," she answered. They stood side by side, steam rising between them, neither speaking much. The silence no longer felt hollow. It had weight, warmth. Inside the cabin, the fire hummed like a small animal breathing. It had been months since the men came with papers and threats. None had returned. Peace had grown in the shape of ordinary days, fixing rails, baking bread, feeding hens. Aiyana laughed, sometimes. Now the sound brief but real, and Silas had started leaving his rifle by the door instead of the bed. That afternoon he brought a small package from town, a silver locket, plain and empty. "No picture," he said. "Didn't seem right to choose one." Aiyana turned it in her palm. "Then it waits," she said, "for something that belongs." They ate supper by lamplight, bread warm from the stove. Outside, the wind softened against the walls. Silas watched her hands move steady, certain, and thought of the auction square of 6 silver coins falling like thunder. He'd bought freedom for a stranger, and found something harder to name. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She looked up, eyes calm. "I think about before," she said. "But before is gone, and after is here." He nodded. That was enough. When dawn returned, the frost had melted from the windows. Aiyana stepped outside, pressed her palm to the young red willow she'd planted. Its branches shivered in the wind, thin but alive. "Grow," she whispered, "for both of us." Behind her, Silas called, "Coffee's ready." She turned, smiling faintly. "Sweet." He lifted the tin pot. Brought sugar this time. They stood in the doorway, sharing warmth and quiet. No vows, no grand ending, just 2 people who had stopped running. Outside, the earth thawed under the snow, learning to breathe again. Inside, the fire burned low, but steady, like something that had learned how to stay. And somewhere beneath the frost, the buried rope slept quiet. Aiyana watched the horizon brighten, the first light brushing gold across the fence line. The world looked fragile and new, pausing before the next beginning. Silas lifted his cup, eyes tracing the same hills, and for a moment neither spoke. There was nothing left that needed saying. The wind moved through the red willow, whispering softly in a language both of them almost understood. She closed the door halfway, keeping the warmth inside. The day would start soon, but for now they stood unowned, unbound, quietly alive.